The sky tore open with fire before dawn, and the ocean beneath shook like it was alive. A wall of steel and thunder was moving across the Pacific, an armada so vast it seemed to erase the horizon itself. Yet what seared itself into memory that morning was not the fleet's size, not the battleships, or the endless rows of carriers, but the trembling voice of one boy in the shadows of the Combat Information Center, Jerry Nakamura, a second-class seaman. His hands shaking as he translated the intercepted Japanese radio chatter, whispered what no one else yet dared to say. "They don't know we're coming." His words cracked like a confession, and tears ran down his face, as if he alone carried the unbearable truth that behind the chatter of mail schedules and movie nights, an empire stood unsuspecting blind to the storm about to break. Tommy McKenna, standing only a few feet away, felt his stomach turn to stone. How could the enemy's strongest fortress be this unprepared? How could ordinary voices drift so casually across the airwaves on the very morning when the largest naval strike force in history was bearing down on them? In that instant, paradox sharpened on one side laughter and routine, on the other the silent approach of destruction crafted on an industrial scale. This was more than another raid, more than another island in a bloody chain. This was the collision of two eras, the end of battleships and the birth of carriers, as factories of death that never slept. McKenna knew without yet seeing a single bomb fall that the ocean itself was about to change ownership. And when it did, nothing in the Pacific or in the world would ever be the same. The tears on Jerry Nakamura's face still burned in Tommy McKenna's mind as he leaned against the steel bulkhead, listening to the low hum of engines pushing the carrier toward history. Those words, "They don't know we're coming," were more than a whisper. They were a crack in the illusion of Japanese invincibility. For 2 years, the enemy had built their empire around a wall of fortresses, a sprawling chain of coral islands, and airstrips they believed could never be breached. From the Aleutians in the north to the Solomons in the south, their defensive perimeter stretched across the map like an iron curtain drawn by admirals who believed geography itself was a weapon. At the center of it all lay Truk Lagoon, a massive anchorage bristling with airfields, supply depots, and hidden gun emplacements that American intelligence had named the Gibraltar of the Pacific. To the Japanese, it was untouchable, the beating heart of a defensive ring designed to bleed the United States white if it dared advance. That was the gamble. Japanese planners believed in arithmetic, measured in corpses. They remembered Tarawa, where over 1,000 Marines fell and thousands more were wounded on a speck of coral smaller than Washington's National Mall. If the cost of one atoll was that high, then surely the price of crossing hundreds of them on the way to Japan would be unbearable. They assumed American democracy, soft and impatient, would fracture under the weight of funerals, that politicians in Washington would trade land and honor for peace once the casualty lists grew too long. In Tokyo's war rooms, the logic seemed unshakable. The outer ring of islands would serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, permanent fortresses bristling with runways and guns, forcing the Americans to smash themselves to pieces one bloody mile at a time. But the Japanese calculation was built on sand. What Jerry Nakamura translated that morning was proof. The enemy's voices on the radio were calm, casual, almost indifferent. They thought themselves secure behind coral and concrete, imagining that the vast Pacific was still their shield. They did not understand what McKenna was beginning to grasp, that the shield had already shattered. In the shipyards of Norfolk, Brooklyn, and Newport News, a new weapon had been forged that rendered the old equations meaningless. The Essex-class carriers were not just ships, they were engines of continuous destruction designed to fight not for hours but for days, weeks, months without pause. America's strength was no longer measured in the barrels of its battleships or the bravery of isolated charges. It was measured in steel tonnage in assembly lines that rolled aircraft off their belts faster than Japan could train pilots to fly them, in oilers that could refuel an entire fleet while still at sea, in doctrines that turned naval warfare into an industrial process. Where Japan prepared for a single decisive blow, America had learned to fight a war of attrition on a scale the world had never seen. The Essex-class could cycle aircraft with mechanical precision elevators, lifting fighters every 90 seconds catapults, hurling bombers skyward every half minute, deck crews moving with the rhythm of a factory line. This was war redefined. Not a clash of fleets in a single afternoon, but an unending storm of sorties grinding down everything in its path. The Japanese clung to the faith that fortresses and courage could withstand such a storm. They built their strategy around the idea of unsinkable carriers. But those coral runways could not move. They could not adapt. They could be bypassed, neutralized, or obliterated from the sky before a single plane ever took off. Worse, their very immobility turned them into traps, targets, waiting to be discovered and dismantled by fleets that could appear anywhere, anytime. It was a paradox, as cruel as it was decisive. The stronger the Japanese built their bastions, the more vulnerable they became once mobility and endurance entered the equation. McKenna felt it in his bones as he listened to the sea rumble under the weight of Task Force 58. This was not just another raid, not just another name to etch on the long list of islands seized and bloodied. The boy crying over radio intercepts had peeled back the curtain. The enemy was still living in yesterday, in a world where battleships decided wars and fortified atolls guaranteed survival. But the men standing on the deck of the Essex were already living in tomorrow. They carried a doctrine born of industry and relentless organization, a doctrine that promised to grind down any defense, no matter how proud, no matter how stubborn. The scale of it was staggering. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, hundreds of cruisers and destroyers, more than 900 aircraft, all converging on one lagoon. The Japanese believed untouchable. Never in history had such power moved as one. And yet, in the pre-dawn darkness, it remained invisible, cloaked in silence, approaching like the judgment of a god the defenders no longer believed in. That was the true horror of Jerry's whisper. They didn't know. They couldn't know. Their faith in fortresses had blinded them to the revolution already underway. For generations, navies had worshipped at the altar of the big gun. The range of a battleship's cannons had been the measure of empires. But in February 1944, those guns were little more than relics, thunderous but obsolete. The future was unfolding on the decks, where McKenna stood, where Hellcats and Avengers waited in neat rows, where ordnance crews loaded bombs, as if feeding a furnace that could never go out. America no longer needed to meet the Japanese fleet in some grand duel of capital ships. It only needed to unleash its factories at sea, wave after wave, until the very concept of a fortress was meaningless. The Japanese had wagered everything on their outer ring on Truk Lagoon, on the illusion of impregnability. They believed geography and courage would halt America at the ocean's edge. But McKenna, staring into the darkness, already knew better. He had heard it in the broken voice of a Hawaiian boy translating enemy transmissions, seen it in the endless rows of aircraft stretching down the deck, felt it in the vibration of turbines driving steel through the waves. This was not the prelude to another bloody stalemate. This was the unveiling of a new age. And when the first bombs fell, when the sky lit with fire and the lagoon turned red with oil and flame, the world would understand what he already knew. The fortress was a lie, the perimeter a mirage, and the Pacific was about to become an ending, American Lake. At that moment, before the first launch signal even flashed, the outcome was written. The enemy thought they were safe, but safety had died. The day America married industry to doctrine. The battle ahead would not just be about ships sunk or aircraft destroyed. It would be about erasing an entire way of war and replacing it with something ruthless, mechanical, unstoppable. For Tommy McKenna, for Jerry Nakamura, for every man aboard the carriers charging toward Truk, the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. They were about to witness the death of the old world and the birth of the new, and nothing, not fortresses, not courage, not even the ocean itself could stand in its way. The echo of McKenna's realization still thrummed through the decks when the true engine of the coming storm revealed itself in full. The new generation of carriers hulking and relentless, their flight decks rising like conveyor belts of death under the cold dawn. Where battleships had once been kings of the sea, these leviathans moved with a different purpose. The Essex-class was not an evolution of the old logic. It was a rupture. Built in yards that never slept, welded by thousands of hands on assembly lines that spat out steel and aircraft with an industrial rhythm. These ships were conceived to do something navies had never demanded before: to manufacture combat. Power, continuously, unceasingly, like factories afloat. If the first section had revealed the folly of static fortresses, this one exposed the mechanism that would exploit that folly. The Essex-class carriers were larger, tougher, and designed for endurance. Beneath their flat, endless decks lay magazines and fueling systems wired for speed. Elevators moved whole aircraft squadrons between hangar and flight deck in a minute and a half. Steam catapults coughed out fighters and bombers at intervals that made the deck into a heartbeat measured in launches. Tanks of avgas sloshed in protected compartments. Ordnance handling systems shuttled bombs and torpedoes with a choreography honed by repetition. Damage control teams trained non-stop to patch, plug, and push the ship back into the fight. Everything about these ships assumed punishment and planned around it. They were built to be used and then used again. The analogy the pilots and deck crews invoked was blunt and right: "We are factories." It was a saying that sounded almost obscene to men who had grown up on stories of single, glorious battles, but it captured the doctrinal transformation. A battleship shot at a single target with brutal, concentrated power. A carrier force generated power as an output over time, a cumulative grinding that a fortress could not match. Where a battleship's big guns were meant to decide a day, the carrier's air groups decided months. An enemy might win a skirmish in the air or sink a ship and celebrate a momentary triumph, but the carrier's relentless production of sorties erased those gains within hours. That difference in tempo, the ability to convert industrial output directly into combat presence at sea, changed everything. The American model treated warfare like manufacturing: trained to standards, codify procedures, measure throughput. Flight decks were organized like factories with checklists, assembly line maintenance, standardized parts, and procedures that allowed a plane serviced on the Essex to be readied again and again without improvisation. Pilots were trained not as lone knights seeking glory, but as technicians in a broader system where the goal was repeatability and return on investment in skill and material. The Hellcat and the Avenger were produced in numbers and ruggedness that allowed doctrine to flourish. If planes were cheap and replaceable by design, men and machines could be pushed harder and more often. The Japanese had not only failed to anticipate this industrialized tempo, they had philosophically misread what a carrier could be. To many in their high command, a carrier remained an elegant instrument for a decisive blow, a floating bastion to be used sparingly in a single climactic engagement. Their doctrine still treasured the notion of massing every available aircraft into a single arrow and loosing it for a knockout punch. That made sense when aircraft were scarce and each sortie had to count. But it was fatal against a doctrine that replaced scarcity with abundance and single throws with grinding barrages. The Japanese envisioned carriers as expensive, sacrosanct icons. Americans treated carriers as production platforms that would consume risk and keep producing. Admiral Mark Mitcher, a hard-eyed, impatient man who had spent years arguing that carriers could be organized into a new kind of fleet, framed it to his commanders with a clarity that brooked no illusion. "We don't go out to win one great fight," he told them in the frameless brevity of his briefings. "We go out to make the other fellow incapable of resisting. We go out to stamp an industry on the sea. When you can fly until the enemy has nothing left to use, and you still have planes on the deck, you have already won." The quote spread through the squadrons, like a doctrine itself. It was less a boast and more a commandment. Under his insistence, task groups practiced night operations, continuous deck cycles, and cross-deck transfers until the choreography became muscle memory. That discipline had tangible mechanics. Continuous flight operations meant air crews worked in shifts, maintenance crews rotated. Logistics pipelines looped from oiler to carrier to plane and back in a steady stream. Underway replenishment, once a risky innovation, became routine. Fleet oilers steamed in hoses, snaked across heaving decks, and carriers took on fuel without breaking their pace. Ammunition ships and supply vessels moved alongside, and crucially, the command structure rotated. Admirals alternated responsibilities so that the fleet never had to stop for planning and recovery. One command pressed, while the other rested and rebuilt. The result was operational tempo that resembled a factory's throughput chart more than a fleet's schedule. The psychological edge this created was enormous. To sit in a fortified hangar and know that your defenders could be struck again and again with fresh waves of aircraft without a predictable lull was to confront a new kind of helplessness. Fortified atolls could not match that pace. Their runways could only launch so many sorties. Their fuel and bombs were finite. Their pilots, exhausted. They were built for a war of attrition measured in bravery. They were not prepared for a war of attrition measured in production. The Japanese system had been optimized for decisive glory. The American system optimized for endurance and replacement for turning material advantage into inexorable pressure. On the Essex's deck that morning, technicians checked gauges and greased hinges with the calm of men who knew what their ships could sustain. The air smelled of oil and ozone, and the faint sweetness of avgas and the rows of fighters and bombers waited like instruments in an orchestra, about to play a new kind of symphony. One composed not for a single crescendo, but for an unending, overwhelming swell. Pilots who had trained in the pattern of coordinated strikes understood their role differently now, to keep the wave moving, to make the defender tire before he could inflict decisive damage. When the first signal was given and the catapults began to fire, the thought that ran through many men's minds was not the glamour of heroics, but the machine-like assurance that the system would keep feeding sorties to the sky. This was not romantic warfare. It was industrial, cold, efficient, and brutally effective. The Essex-class and the doctrine it carried were not merely tools of war. They were a new grammar of force. Against fortresses and philosophies that prized singular sacrificial brilliance, the American carriers offered endless repetition, redundancy, and the terrible arithmetic of factories at war. By the time the sun climbed over the horizon and the first wave of Hellcats streaked away from the deck, the point had already been made. The carriers did not need to be magnificent in isolation. They needed only to be relentless. And that relentlessness, born of shipyards and doctrine, and the grim determinism of industrial warfare, would not simply win battles. It would rewrite what counted as naval power for generations to come. The storm broke just after sunrise. Out of the eastern sky came the roar of engines, a wave of American Hellcats diving low over the pale waters of Truk Lagoon. They had slipped across the ocean unseen, and now they fell upon the fortress the Japanese had believed untouchable. Within minutes, the air above Truk was a battlefield once so lopsided that it barely deserved the name. The first Japanese Zeros clawed into the air in ragged formations, their green fuselages glinting in the morning light. Most of the men in their cockpits were young, barely trained, thrown into the sky with little more than courage. Against them came Hellcats, heavy, fast-armored beasts with claws of .50 caliber fire. Lieutenant Roy Rushing from the USS Lexington described what followed as the most one-sided fight he had ever seen. The Hellcats dove with the advantage of altitude and speed, tearing through the Zeros like hawks among sparrows. Bullets ripped through thin metal cockpits, burst into flame, and one by one the Japanese fighters spiraled into the lagoon or exploded mid-air. One clash stood out. A veteran Zero pilot, perhaps one of the few who had survived the long attrition of Rabaul, wheeled sharply to shake the Hellcat on his tail. He turned inside his pursuer with all the grace that had once made the Zero feared. But the Hellcat did not break. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney engine roared, its wings held steady, and its guns spat until the Zero's fuel tank erupted. The Japanese ace fell in fire, his skill wasted against brute resilience and raw horsepower. The battle was not between equals, it was between eras. By mid-morning, the sky was clear. 50 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, many still burning on the runways, while the Americans counted only 4 Hellcats lost. The fortress of Truk, meant to be shielded by its air power, had been stripped bare before the real attack even began. And then the second wave came. Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes swept over the lagoon, escorted by Corsairs and more Hellcats. Their targets lay below a harbor crammed with ships, destroyers, cruisers, repair vessels, transports, tankers, everything the Japanese needed to keep their Central Pacific fleet alive. The first Dauntless to dive chose the Rio de Janeiro Maru, a converted passenger liner now serving as a submarine tender. Bomb doors opened, the plane shrieked downward, and a 1,000-pound bomb slammed into the ship's midsection. Seconds later, the lagoon erupted with the force of the blast, steel plates twisting skyward, smoke and fire pouring into the sky. The Maru rolled and sank in minutes, taking with her the tools and lifeblood of the Japanese submarine force. All across the anchorage, chaos reigned. The light cruiser Katori tried to escape through the northern channel, only to be caught by Avengers from the Intrepid. Torpedoes slammed into her hull, ripping open her sides, and she vanished beneath the waves with all hands. The destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki, their crews scrambling to raise steam, were pounded into wreckage before they could maneuver. Transports loaded with ammunition exploded like volcanoes. One blast so massive it sent a column of black smoke punching into the clouds. Oil tanks burst, spreading sheets of flame across the lagoon until the water itself seemed to burn. For the Americans, circling above the view was apocalyptic. Ships collided in panic. Men hurled themselves overboard. Lifeboats burned as they touched the fire-slicked surface. Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was dying in real time. Each strike was not just destruction, it was erasure. Years of Japanese effort, mountains of supplies, the illusion of security, all undone in a few hours of coordinated fury. McKenna, watching from the Essex, as bombers thundered off the deck and returned again laden with smoke-blackened wings, felt the truth press down on him. This was not just a raid. This was the unveiling of the new age he had sensed in Jerry Nakamura's trembling whisper. The Japanese had built their fortress on the faith that courage and concrete could resist. But courage burns when it meets gasoline, and concrete cracks when fire falls from the sky. The Essex-class carriers and their endless, tireless cycles of flight had turned the ocean into a factory of death, and Truk Lagoon had become its first great demonstration. By nightfall, the once mighty anchorage was a graveyard. More than 20 ships lay shattered on the bottom, hundreds of planes, destroyed warehouses, and fuel dumps still burning. The fortress was gone, its strength reduced to wreckage and oil slicks. For the men of Task Force 58, it was proof of what they already suspected: the old order of naval war had ended. For the Japanese, it was revelation by fire, a sudden and terrible clarity that their defenses could not hold. The opening strike had been swift, merciless, and decisive, the perfect embodiment of a doctrine born in American shipyards and perfected on American decks. The sky had been swept clean, the lagoon had been set ablaze, and the Empire's illusion of invulnerability had sunk with its ships. The old world had collapsed in smoke and flame, and from its ruins the new masters of the Pacific had risen. The smoke still clung to the horizon after the wreckage of Truk, when the true secret of American power revealed itself not in the fire of the first strike, but in what followed after. Any other navy might have paused, regrouped, licked its wounds after such a furious blow. But Task Force 58 did not pause. The flight decks kept turning, the elevators kept rising and falling, the catapults kept spitting aircraft into the sky with the rhythm of a machine that never slept. Where the Japanese had imagined the raid would burn itself out in a single day of fury, the Americans returned on the second day and the third with the same relentless pace, as if destruction itself had been put on an assembly line. This endurance was the true revolution. Fuel hoses snaked across decks as fleet oilers refueled carriers and open water ammunition. Ships pulled alongside and poured tons of bombs and shells into magazines, and maintenance crews worked through the night to patch bullet holes. Replace engines and send planes back into the fight before dawn. Every man aboard understood his role in this cycle. Pilots flew until exhaustion, then slept where they fell, only to be shaken awake for another sortie. Deck crews lived in the roar of engines and the smell of gasoline, their bodies covered in grime and burns, but the tempo never faltered. Even when a carrier took damage, she did not leave the fight. The USS Franklin proved it. She was struck by Japanese bombs more than once, her decks torn open, her hangar ablaze, hundreds of her crew killed in minutes. By any conventional logic, she should have gone down. But damage control parties trained and drilled until reaction was muscle memory, fought through smoke and flame to save her. Hoses blasted fire, steel doors slammed shut. Bombs were heaved overboard before they could cook off. The ship bled, but she lived. Within days she was steaming again, her decks blackened but operational, her aircraft once more clawing into the sky. This was the American doctrine, made flesh not indestructibility, but resilience, the ability to take punishment and still continue the cycle. A damaged ship was not a dead ship. It was a wounded factory patched and forced back to work. Against this, the Japanese crumbled. Their pilots, already stretched thin, flew until their fuel tanks ran dry. Their planes shot down faster than replacements could be built. The once elite cadres of aviators that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea were gone. Their places filled by boys rushed through flight schools with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. Courage they had in abundance, but courage without training was only sacrifice. Each time American Hellcats carved through another formation, Japan's future in the skies dimmed further. Worse still, the logistics that had once sustained Japan's empire were unraveling. American submarines prowled the sea lanes with ruthless efficiency, armed not just with torpedoes, but with intelligence fed by codebreakers who knew where convoys would pass before the ships themselves did. Tankers carrying aviation gasoline transports stacked with aircraft parts, cargo ships loaded with food and ammunition, all fell to the silent hunters beneath the waves. Convoys burned in the night lifeboats, scattered across black seas, and with each sinking, another piece of Japan's war machine vanished beneath the waves. Reports began to cross the desks of Japanese admirals, each more damning than the last. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of Pearl Harbor, admitted bitterly that the enemy's carriers were larger, tougher, and capable of a tempo his forces could not match. Captain Atsushi Oi wrote that American task forces operated like mobile air bases that could never be neutralized. Their own carriers, fragile and irreplaceable, could no longer leave port without risking annihilation. "We cannot answer this," he confessed. The tone of these reports was no longer confident prediction, but quiet despair. The recognition that the war they had prepared for was not the war they were fighting. On the ground, shortages bit deeper with every month. Fuel rationing grounded aircraft. Pilots were sent into combat with little more than the basics of takeoff and landing. Ammunition was scarce maintenance, impossible morale collapsing. Bases once bristling with activity stood silent, their runways cracked, their hangars empty, while the Americans advanced from one stepping stone to the next. Each island seized turned instantly into another launch pad. Meanwhile, the American juggernaut only grew more confident. The men of Task Force 58 understood that their power lay not just in firepower, but in the knowledge that tomorrow and the next day and the next week they would still be there, launching wave after wave until the enemy broke. Pilots knew that if they were shot down, another squadron would follow. Commanders knew that if one ship faltered, others would close ranks and carry the burden. It was a collective strength, a machine designed to grind down resistance through sheer persistence. McKenna, watching the endless ballet of launches and recoveries, grasped the larger truth: the enemy had built their doctrine around decisive moments, single battles that could turn history. But America had built its doctrine around time, around the slow but unstoppable weight of attrition that only an industrial giant could sustain. The Japanese had prepared to fight like swordsmen. The Americans were fighting like a factory. One by one, every advantage Japan thought permanent was eroded. Not just in fire and steel, but in the inability to keep up, to replace, to endure. By early 1944, the contrast was brutal. On one side, a navy that bled but never stopped repairing ships at sea, feeding carriers with endless streams of fuel and ammunition, flying sorties around the clock. On the other, a navy trapped in its own shrinking perimeter, starved of pilots, starved of fuel, starved of hope. Its commanders writing reports that read less like strategies and more like obituaries. And beneath it all, the submarines kept cutting the arteries, each sinking another reminder that Japan's empire was dying, not just in flames, but in silence. The battle at Truk had shown the spectacle, the burning ships, the exploding depots, the collapsing illusion of a fortress. But what followed the days and weeks of continuous pressure revealed the deeper weapon: endurance. America's war machine did not need to win in a day. It only needed to keep going. And as long as it kept going, the outcome was inevitable. For McKenna, for Jerry Nakamura, for every man on the Essex, the realization was the same. They were not just witnessing a battle. They were watching the slow death of an enemy who could no longer breathe, strangled by a war it had no strength left to fight. The collapse of Truk and the endless tempo that followed left no doubt about the shape of the war's future. Every battle that came after the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, Okinawa was less a question of possibility than of confirmation. When the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot obliterated Japan's last trained aviators, it was not a surprise, but the inevitable fulfillment of what had already been proven, that America's carriers could outlast, outfight, and outproduce any resistance. At Okinawa, when kamikazes rained down in waves of desperation, the Essex-class ships absorbed the punishment, burned, bled, and yet kept launching aircraft for 3 months straight. Where another fleet might have broken the American task, forces simply endured grim and unyielding. For the men who had stood on those flight decks from the beginning, the lesson was inescapable. Tommy McKenna, years later, would tell his family that he had witnessed the moment naval history split in two. "We had built something new," he wrote. "Not just ships, not just planes, but a way of fighting. We showed that a fleet could be more than steel and guns. It could be an engine that never stopped." His words carried the weight of a man who had seen the old world die in smoke and flame and watched a new one rise out of the ocean spray. The triumph was not only in machines, though the machines were formidable. It was in the discipline of organization, the foresight of logistics, and the will to sustain pressure without breaking. America's genius was not only that it could build carriers in dozens or planes by the tens of thousands, but that it could weave them into a living system where every part supported the whole. Oilers, submarines, Seabees, pilots, deckhands, admirals. It was the sum of all of them that crushed the fortress walls of an empire. Japan's courage was real, but courage without the scaffolding of endurance collapsed against a tide that never ceased. The legacy reached far beyond 1945. When the Essex steamed into Tokyo Bay for the surrender, her flight deck cleared for ceremony, rather than combat, the men aboard understood that the war had been won, not in one moment, but in countless cycles of launch and recovery in the manned grind of a system that refused to stop. That system became the blueprint of modern naval power. Nuclear carriers of the Cold War battle groups patrolling distant seas, the projection of force across oceans, all of it traced back to those months when Task Force 58 turned the Pacific into an American lake. McKenna's whisper of recognition on that pre-dawn morning had become a prophecy fulfilled. The fortress was a lie, the perimeter a mirage, and the age of the battleship had ended. What replaced it was more than a weapon. It was a doctrine, a philosophy of endurance, an understanding that victory in modern war belonged not to the boldest strike, but to the power that could keep striking long after the enemy had nothing left. And that doctrine, born on the decks of the Essex-class, would shape the seas not just for the war they fought, but for the century to come. The story of the Essex-class carriers is not only a chronicle of battles won, but of a vision that reshaped war itself. From the shattered illusions at Truk to the relentless advance across the Marianas and Okinawa, these ships proved that endurance, organization, and unity could overcome any fortress or fleet. They showed the world that courage alone was never enough, that victory belonged to those who could sustain, adapt, and rise again after every blow. Today, their legacy is more than history. It is a reminder. In every struggle, whether on seas and nations or within ourselves, strength lies in persistence, in systems built to endure, and in communities that refuse to yield. Let us carry that lesson forward. Let us honor those who fought not by remembering only their triumphs, but by living with the same resolve to build, to endure, and to never stop moving toward victory.